Chapter 129, still in the Shir Hamales, in the Song of Ascents. This chapter is somewhat longer than some of the other chapters, but it's still pretty short. I think it's 9 verses, and they're fairly simple, short verses. And it's a song of praise, although, a song of ascents, because it you'll see in a second, but it really focuses on, in the first half, the downtroddenness of the Jewish people in the beginning of their history, but then in transitions in the second half to the destruction of the nations of the world and how they will face obliteration during the end of history. And it's written from the perspective of the end of history, written from the end of time, the coming of Mashiach. It doesn't clearly state that, but it seems to be the point of view of the chapter. So Mashiach has come, the exiles having gathered in, there's been a redemption, Mashiach is here, and we are seeing all the blessings of all of history, and we're looking back at what we went through. And we're kind of weaving the story of history together, bigadol, as we say, the big picture. And it focuses on the youth of the Jewish people. And it's interesting, it kind of contrasts the youth of the Jewish people with the old age of the nations of the world. So two things are implied, that what we say about the youth of the Jewish people is not what the nations of the world are experiencing. They have the opposite. And then what the nations of the world experience in their old age is going to be the opposite of what the Jewish people experience in their old age. So you'll see what that means as we go through it. But the first 3 verses are going to be all about the suffering of the Jewish people in the time of their youth. Now, the time of their youth can refer to a lot of times in history, because obviously the Jewish people have suffered through a lot of history. It seems to have specific reference to the time of the exile in Mitzrayim. There's some psukim that refer to that as the time of our youth. Or you might be familiar with the pasuk of Koyamar Hashem Zacharti Lach Chesed Ne'urayich. God says, "I remember the kindness of your youth. Lechtech Acharai Bamidbar." That you went after me into the desert. So you left the somewhat security of Egypt where you suffered, but at least you knew what you were to expect, and you went into the desert where it was all unknown. There's other psukim as well. So there's really a time of our youth is a time of suffering, the time of exile, but it also refers to throughout history, probably still till today. We're still in the youth of the Jewish people. We're still suffering. We've gone through continuous exiles with some periods of redemption in between, but we haven't reached the final maturity of the Jewish people, the recognition of our role in history and God. So we're still within our youth. But again, a specific focus on the time of Egypt. But again, the message being, yes, that's our youth, but let's look at the whole picture. So let's start the first verse. Shir Hamales, the Song of Ascents. Rabbis Tziraruni Minu Urai. They have they have there have been so many sufferings since my youth. Yomer na Yisrael, that is now what the Jewish people declare. So Yomer na, say now, that's what gives us the perspective of the time of redemption. We're standing now at the time of Geula in this chapter and looking back at all the suffering of our youth, and we say, wow, there has been so much. We're almost marveling at what we endured, the resilience and endurance of the Jewish people throughout history. And Rav Hirsch also notes that this pasuk is also supposed to be stressing that anti-Semitism is nothing new. It's been around since the time of our youth. Rabbi Siraruni Minu Urai. We can say now that it's just been getting worse and worse for millennia. It's been passed down and inculcated and deepened from generation to generation in the nations of the world. All of the suffering that we face on their hands. And the second verse really just repeats the first verse. Rabbi Siraruni Minu Urai. That's actually the exact same words. Since my youth, they have often made me suffer. And the commentators explain the reason for the repetition is because the nations of the world and the anti-Semitism and the torture that we endured then and since then have always been dual. There's always been the physical and the spiritual aspect of it. They try and destroy us physically, they try and destroy us spiritually. That's always their goal. Sometimes they're more clear about one over the other. The Purim story is more about physical destruction. Hanukkah story is more about spiritual destruction. But in general, they're both there. But concludes the second pasuk, Gam lo yachlu li, but they never succeeded in being able to destroy us. Not physically, we're still here, and not spiritually. We're still here studying God's Torah and doing His mitzvahs and believing in Him as well. Pasuk Gimel, al gabai charshu charshim. On my back, the plowers plowed, he'erichu lema'anisam, and they lengthened their furrows. And again, pretty strong imagery here that they tried throughout history to cripple us with excessive burden, with torture. The imagery is as if they've thrown us to the ground and plowed over our backs, or like oxen that they lengthening the furrows. So when someone is plowing with an ox, they don't stop until the end of the furrow. It's like one shot. So too, the nations of the world have this continuous torture of the Jewish people with no respite. They don't give us a break. Like we're in this same run. There's no stopping. And there's a specific reference here, some of the commentators say, the Sforno says, to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, because Turnus Rufus, who destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash, said that wasn't enough. And he returned 60 years later to plow over the Temple Mount and totally obliterate every trace of the holy site. But that's all Pasuk 1, 2, and 3. Again, looking back at history, focus on Egypt, maybe reference to the destruction of the temple, but it just never stops. It's been something we dealt with till today and through all of our history that we suffer at the hands of the nations of the world. But in Pasuk Daled, it all turns around. And what happens at the end of time? Hashem Tzadik Kitzetz Aves Risham. God is the righteous one, and he snaps the cords of the rich of the wicked. Using this imagery as if again we're bent over by the burdens of exile. So God comes and snaps the ropes, and suddenly everything falls off, and we stand up straight and tall, relieved of the burden. And then the next pasuk is God's response to the nations of the world. Yevoshu v'yisoigu achar kol soni tzion. Let all those who hate Zion fall back in disgrace. The Sifra takes this image and says, like, imagine that someone lent an ox to their friend, and then they walk into the field and they see that the ox is laden with a burden which is much too heavy. So the first thing that the owner does is kitzetz avis. He snaps the burdens. He helps his ox immediately. Then, as the next verse says, then he turns to his friend and says, "What are you doing? How can you do this to my animal?" So Hashem also, first he relieves the Jewish people of their burden in verse 4, then in verse 5, he turns to the nations of the world and causes them to fall back in disgrace. Yivoshu, they will be disgraced, and then Yisoigu, hard word to translate, but seems to mean turns back, which means that they'll be in a constant state of decline. Then the next two verses, 6 and 7, are, I guess there's only 8 verses in this chapter, are again continued imagery, but focusing on referencing the nations of the world as being like this parasitic grass, like a weed that springs up. Yihu kechatzir gagois. They're going to be like grass on the roof, like a parasitic grass that sprouts haphazardly in the nooks and crannies, tiny patches of dirt that gathers on the roof, and it's doomed to just wither with the passage of time. And that's what our enemies are. They're parasites that seek to exploit the Jewish people, use their hatred of us to gain prominence, wealth, and power, but they all wither and fall over time. And so quickly, shekadmas shalaf yavesh, as the pasuk says, before they can be pulled up, meaning before they can be harvested, they fade, which is supposed to convey the imagery that they don't even produce anything. There's nothing left of them. Look at the nations of the world. All the ones, the Romans and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Persians, there's nothing significant left of them. Like, what did they even contribute to history? And it says in verse 7, Shaloi mile kapoi koitzer. The reaper can't even fill his hand with them. V'chitzle ma'amar, not even an armful for the gatherer of sheaves. This parasitic grass of the nations of the world is so flimsy that it withers by itself before it can be plucked. And it fades so quickly that there's nothing, not even a handful left of what it produces. And then actually the last verse also continues this imagery. The passers-by don't say, Birkas Hashem Aleichem, may God's blessing be upon you, Beirachnu Eschem Hashem Hashem, or we bless you with God's name. That's referencing a interesting historic concept that when the harvest was complete, it used to be customary for people to greet the harvesters with Baruch Hashem, blessed is God, but not when the harvest was not doing well. When the harvest didn't do well, they didn't give that blessing. So here too, the wicked, they don't get the blessing of God because they don't produce anything. So people don't say blessed is God about them. And this is a very strong contrast to the Jewish people. It doesn't really make the contrast clear in this chapter, but in chapter 92, similar imagery is used about the nations of the world, that they're this withered grass, but then it contrasts it to the Jewish people, calling them tall date palms. Right? Katamar Yifrach, they're going to be Oyunuvim Beseva, they're going to be like a tall date palm, fresh and vigorous in their old age. So Jewish people do have an everlasting legacy, and they do remain strong in their old age. And again, the contrast between the first half and the second half of the chapter is that in our youth, the Jewish people's youth, we don't really have anything. We suffer, we're downtrodden, we're oppressed, as opposed to the nations of the world, that they flourish and they seem to be so glorious. But what happens in the end? All of that growth in the nations of the world, in their adulthood, at the end of time, they disappear. They quickly fade. They don't even have anything left no memory of them will remain. As opposed to the Jewish people, yes, in our youth we suffered, but look at the whole picture. And the history of the Jewish people will show, the future will show. Where we are still here today, and the future will show that we will continue to thrive, and we will leave behind. We won't just leave behind so much of value. We will never leave. We will be fresh and vigorous in our old age. The youth was challenging, but our old age today and with the coming of Mashiach, we will be eternally great serving Hashem. Thank you for joining. I know that was a quick chapter, but I think it was a powerful one.